Good evening. Welcome back to the Bible Speaks Today from LBC Television Ministries. It's been a couple of weeks since we've been in the studio. Of course, you haven't noticed anything, although if you were watching last week, you may have seen a much younger version, or last night actually would be, for you, but because of some other problems we had here in the studio and the control room and commitments some of the staff had made, we actually put on a repeat last week for you, and it was remarked by the librarian when he told me what he put on. It was from '09, which was a number of years ago, and I was a lot lighter and had more hair, certainly darker anyway. I'm not sure if I still had the beard or not. Anyway, so yes, it is me real, not a repeat. Although tonight's program is going to be looking at some things. We're going to be jumping around all over the place. Hopefully it'll be interesting to you. It certainly was interesting to me, digging out all these different facets of information that people have commented on at one time or another. Before I start this week, I do this every so often. We're coming up into Christmas shortly, and so possibly the next few programs will be dealing with that time of the year, and the subject matter of that time of the year. So if you've got a Christmas question, or a question about the Bible, or how we look at things, about Christmas, by all means send me an email and we'll see if we can include it in. I mean, we don't do requests per se. It's not a top 10 program, but sometimes it's nice to see what people are curious about. In fact, one of the first things we're going to be talking about tonight when we get into it is actually a question somebody sent in, and when I walked in the studio this evening, the chief cameraman said, who gets involved in these things somehow, he said, what's the title? And I thought, I haven't got a title. So I looked at the first three words on my notes, and it said, Too Many Camels. So that is why it is called Too Many Camels. There is a reason. You will see it in a minute. First of all, though, I like to talk sometimes on these programs about something that's happened in the real world. In the world around us recently. And my wife's son brought home a movie the other day called Son of God. If you're not familiar with it, it's like made by the same people, Roma Downey and her husband and some other people, who made the Bible film that you either loved or didn't like, depending on your particular viewpoint. But this was the Son of God, the story of Jesus, and I will say this: well made in the technical sense of the word, well acted. I mean, certainly better than I can do, and reasonably following the story. I think they took a few liberties, and of course, when you take stories from the Bible and try and translate them into film, you can either take it literally as the words say, for example, Jesus walking on the water or something like that, or you can try and sort of wrap it up into some sort of lesson that you could learn from this. So they did a pretty good job. But what really impressed me, and I'm not really often impressed with Hollywood's version of religious themes. They don't seem to do a very good job of it, whatever faith it is they're talking about. Was in this is the first film, I think, and I know, having said that, I'm going to get all sorts of comments back from you movie watchers who've seen it all before, but it's the first film of any import I've seen telling the story of Jesus which has Mary Magdalene portrayed in a positive role. In other words, as one of the disciples. You'll remember some months ago we meaning here, LBC, did a series of programs, one of which was about women's position in the church and the position of the women in the early church. And Mary Magdalene, and I went to some lengths to suppose that Mary Magdalene may even have been the apostle to the apostles. In other words, somebody much more important than the church has given her credit for. And if you'll remember, I went on to explain that in the end of the first and the beginning of the second century of the early church, they tried to downplay, or they didn't try, they did it. They downplayed the role of women as much as possible, and developed this misogynistic, male-dominated church hierarchy, which, to be honest, still exists today. Not in every denomination, but certainly in some. And this film portrayed Mary as being part of the team that followed Jesus, as being part of the entourage. And in fact, there's one small scene which probably everybody missed, where she actually explains what Jesus is trying to say to them, which goes on to what I was saying about being the apostle to the apostles. And whereas normally Mary is always considered to be the woman taken in adultery, and where Jesus says, who among you hasn't sinned, throw the first stone. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Really, if you're a Bible scholar, you know that's not the same person. What was interesting in the movie, though, was they portrayed the woman not as a young, gorgeous, streetwalker, but as an older, middle-aged almost woman, and not richly dressed and poorly dressed. In other words, somebody just likely for the temple priests to pick on and get away with it. And it's just interesting that somebody making a film like that, and I know, or I'm led to believe that the Roma Downey group tend to lean towards Catholicism in a great way, and the Catholic faith as a rule doesn't treat Mary Magdalene with a great deal of respect. It's more the Protestants who've come around to saying, hey, maybe she wasn't this bad woman, maybe there's more to it than that. We'll probably never know, not in this lifetime anyway. But it was interesting to see. So if you haven't seen the movie, and I'm not promoting it by any means, but if you haven't seen it and would like to see a portrayal that's not the usual one, then by all means, it's probably on DVD by now, or it's Netflix or one of those things. You can get it from there. It's worth seeing. As I say, there's a lot of things in it that I think are very praiseworthy. I think they stretch the point of things too much. The other film this young man brought home some weeks later was The Thing Called Noah. And if ever there was a complete, in my opinion, a complete and utter destruction of the Noah story to make it either more interesting or more palatable or whatever, that was it. I don't know where they were going with that. If you've seen it, you know what I mean. It just borders the bounds of realism of any sort. And it's sad because it was some well-known actors and actresses in it and a well-known director, but it was, 2/3 into the film I was ready to give it up. But as always, you want to see the end, you keep hoping it's going to get better, and it didn't. Anyway, never mind. So there's a couple of social comments, if you will. Now back to tonight's programme, and a big heaving sigh from the control room there. Too many camels. Okay, now there are, in fact, too many camels in the Bible, both out of time and certainly out of place. Something you may not think about. You think of the old patriarchs, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the tribes in the desert, and you think camels. Well, no. Camels had little to do with anything that the Joseph story or the Abraham stories, because they didn't exist. Well, I say they didn't exist. They weren't domesticated by then. There's about 20 or 30 mentions of camels as pack animals back in Genesis and Leviticus and the early books. And in fact, they weren't used. They probably existed, but they weren't used as domesticated animals. In Genesis 24, there's a story about Abraham's servant going by camel on a mission to find a wife for Isaac. Well, good luck with that. But what is interesting is that these little anachronisms, if you will, are more information to tell us that the Bible stories were put down in writing well after they happened, and they were put down with the information that the people had at the time. In other words, they weren't people didn't say, I think Abraham rode a camel. They kind of went, Abraham went over here. Well, he must have been on a camel because that's what we use. If you like, it's if you were writing a historical fact about medieval England, and you said, and then Robin and his band went from Nottingham to Sherwood Forest, and they took a bus, okay, because that's what you take today. You understand what I mean? You get things included in there, and in fact, it bothered people so much. Certainly, some of the archaeologists in Israel, that they had a big archaeological dig in the Arava Valley in Israel, the big valley in Israel, where they used to get gold from. They and there's a place next to it called the Wadi Finian, and they were digging there, looking for evidence of when domesticated camels were first introduced. And they used the old standard radiocarbon and this sort of thing. And the earliest known domesticated camel that they could find in the desert was the back end of the 10th century BC, hundreds of years after the patriarchs, and even 50 or 60 years after David's the kingdom of David existed. They did find camel bones in deeper down, in the sediment, in the rocks, but they were probably wild camels, because camels, I think, existed. They just weren't used as domesticated. And my big question was, and I was reading this and looking at it, well, that's interesting. How do they tell if it's domesticated? Well, apparently, if you look at the leg bones of a camel, if it's been domesticated, then they show signs of carrying heavy loads. Probably got swollen or cracks in them or something like that. So it's been carried as a beast of burden. My legs probably show the same way. Okay. But anyway, it was the origin of the domesticated camel. Just a matter of interest, was from the Arabian desert. Well, no surprise there, but it borders the Arava Valley, and the Egyptians used to get copper, especially, and some other minerals out of there, and probably had a big hand in introducing camels. Oh look, we need some beasts of burden here. We need to utilize them because this area is pretty desolate. Previous to that, they'd used mules and donkeys. And you have to understand that the development of Israel, or in those days, that region of the country, the camel, in fact, increased the trade routes. In the time after David, Israel was at the cornerstone of the trade routes going up and down the coast there. And the camel, in fact, enabled long-distance travel to be accomplished a lot faster through the big perfume trade through Arabia and that sort of thing. And mules and donkeys just don't do very well in the desert, as you probably know. The interesting thing is it also spread the Old Testament, the Jewish faith, the same way, because it was taking Jews, Israelis, if you will, up and down the coast and establishing new residencies and things like that. So I think by the 7th century BC, 700 years before Christ, that they were very widely used in Israel and very much part of the establishment, all the way through from Africa and as far as India, which kind of lends credence to the belief that the patriarchal stories were written and canonized in the Bible much later than the actual events took place, which is something most scholars have gone along with anyway. And it doesn't mean they haven't captured the other details in that period of time, just that the camels weren't there. But I have to reassure any young persons who are watching me, or those people who have a great regard for tradition, in that the wise men coming from the east on camels probably was absolutely true, because by that time the camel was a big part of travelling, certainly long distances. And if the wise men, as we believe, came from Persia, then they certainly would have used camels. Okay, so that's the title of the program, but we're going to go on to some other things. Okay. Actually, that was an answer to a question a watcher somebody following the program, whatever, went in and asked when camels, they'd heard that camels didn't exist, therefore the Bible was wrong. You know how that goes. So, no, there weren't camels around in the time of Abraham. Yes, there were camels around at the time of Christ. So, your crib scene for Christmas is very safe in having a camel in the background. Okay, that's very reassuring, you know. Okay, the next question I had, and it was something I talked about in when I was discussing the Gospel of Mark, because he made some reference to it, is the publican. Now, if you're English like me, or even if you're not, but you've been over in England several times, you'll know that the publican in England is the landlord of a public house, the bar, the hotel, the inn, whatever you want to call it, and it's a honoured profession. I mean, if you went in, people say, "What do you do?" "Oh, I'm a publican." "Oh, really?" You know, back in the time of Christ, of course, and before and after, it wasn't anything like that at all. I mean, the Latin word publicanus is where it comes from, and that itself, and that also comes from a Greek word, telones, which means a tax gatherer. Now, there have been taxes since time immemorial. Okay, I think that if we could trace it back, that Ugg, the caveman who lived by the waterhole, charged Gog, the caveman who lived half a mile up the stream, X numbers of brontosaurus steaks so he could use the waterhole. That was his tax. I mean, it's been with us and likely to remain with us forever. Okay. The publican is mentioned a lot in the life of Christ. And you have to understand that Israel was under Roman rule. We all remember that, okay? And part of a province. It was a province of the Roman Empire. In other words, if you like, it was a state of the Roman Empire. Like Kentucky is a state of the United States of America, so Palestine was, or Israel was a state of the Roman Empire. No more, no less. And the customs duties were farmed out. Now, it's kind of an interesting way how they did this. Well-known political people in Rome would pay for the privilege of being responsible for the taxes of Israel. Let's say, for example, somebody said, "Okay, Caesar, if you like, I'll give you, 300,000 sesterces, and I'll be responsible for the taxes from Israel." Okay, so the bean counters would say, "Fine, from Israel every year we expect goods, money, oil, whatever it was, to the value of $1 million. Okay, so as long as you bring in $1 million every year, you keep it. So, all right, the gentleman who's now bid on the contract, if you will, would say, fine, if I got to bring in 1 million to keep them happy, then I need at least $500,000 to keep me happy, so the tax levy on Israel will be $1.5 million. I mean, I know it's not the same money, but I'm just trying to give you an idea, okay? He then would select regular tax, sort of regional tax gatherers throughout the provinces, or the province where he has, and say, okay, I have to get 1.5 million, you get $500,000, you get $500,000, and you get $500,000. Anything you make over that's yours. They in turn said, okay, what if I got to make $500,000, so I need $750,000, because I've got to have money for myself. And that's how it went on down. Okay? And the idea of Rome's idea was that the citizens of Rome and Rome itself would be kept up, fed, houses built, temples built, this sort of thing, and the money would come from the provinces. It makes sense from that point of view. The people you've conquered pay to keep you in your lifestyle. Much as we do today, we pay to keep other people in their lifestyles, don't we? Judah was in the province of Syria, and in Syria in that time, and I've got some figures here, every man had to pay 1% of his annual income for income tax. Now, people weren't paid like we were today, where you go to your bank statement and they either pay you in an envelope or they pay it direct to your bank, and then they say, okay, you got paid $1,000, okay, $100 is ours. People got paid in grain, in corn, in animals, in olive oil, all sorts of things. But whatever it was worth, and everything had a value, okay, if you earned, $10,000 from your farm or your holdings or your olive trees or whatever, then 1% of it went to the government. And you think, well, that's not bad. I mean, let's be honest. If all we had to pay, any of us, was 1% on income tax, we'd be living high on the hog, wouldn't we? Of course, the state would be broke, but that's not the point. But that wasn't all. There was also import and export taxes. If you send oil to Syria, or you sent oil to Samaria or to Egypt or something like that, you had to pay import and export taxes. You had to pay crop taxes if you had fields of corn or wheat and this sort of thing. You had to pay 1/10 of the value of your grain crop. So if you collected, 150 bushels of corn, then 1/10 of a percent, 1/10 of it, not 1/10 of a percent, 1/10 of every you had went to the government. 1/5 of wine, fruit, olive oil, you name it. If it could be produced and you got some of it, that much. There was sales tax, well, we heard that before, property tax. There was even something called an emergency tax, which is like we pay now for our schools and libraries and things like that to keep the infrastructure going. Okay? And as I said, there was a guy locally who then farmed it out even for the chap who had 1/3 of the province, the 500,000 chap, then farmed it out to local people to do the actual gathering. So everybody is getting their cut. So whereas the actual amount of money going to Rome was $1 million, something like $2 million, as far as referencing the figures, was collected to make sure everybody up the line got their cut. It sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? Okay. And most of the time, of course, when the Bible refers to a publican, they're not talking to the head guy. They're talking to the chap, face-to-face guy, the local chap, the local office. Okay? And as we'll see, looking at different references here, these were in a relationship with Rome. In other words, they're working for Rome. Israel's a conquered nation. All the Jews hate Rome. Biblically, they should hate Rome. Biblically, they should have nothing to do with them. They were Gentiles, lower than dirt. And yet here were these people making a living, basically extorting money from good, hard-working Jews to pay to the Romans. They were considered about the worst kinds of sinners, lower than prostitutes. And here's Jesus being nice to them. We probably don't, we think, oh, that's nice of Jesus being nice to the tax collector. You have no idea of how that must have been a slap in the face to the ruling of temple authorities. I mean, Matthew, as far as we know, was a tax collector. I mean, despised person. I mean, people would cross the street rather than have to pass by him. Nobody sat with him at the temple if he ever went there. And if he did, they probably wouldn't take his money. And yet here's Jesus being nice to people. You got to understand that these publicans were literally face to face with their own people. Okay? I mean, it rubbed people's faces in the fact that Rome was in charge. Religiously, the tax was wrong. I mean, if you read all the old rabbis' discussions on it, the tax was an imposition, and to pay it was considered a sinful act of disloyalty to God. I mean, that's how serious it was. You had to pay it because they lock you up or impound your farm or everything else, but in fact, they were being disloyal to God. The tax collector paid, as I just said, a fixed sum to the next chap up the line, the regional chap. So everything he made over and above what was due was his. That's how he made his living, his cut, if you will. And here's the interesting thing. Just like today, the taxes were arbitrary sometimes. I mean, how do you judge how much a field of corn or 20 bushels of corn is worth, depending on the market value, whatever have you. They were vague and indefinite. There's a wonderful book written by a chap called Schurer, where he's actually researched the tax laws of the day, and they're as bad as the ones we have today. Each different collector of taxes interpreted it his own way. So one chap might say you owe me $30 for that. Another chap may say no, in this area it's 50. It was a really bad situation. So what it made the publican was a bit of a petty tyrant, the worst of them, a petty tyrant, certainly a renegade, absolutely an extortioner, and so their common status in Judaism was extremely low. And yet it's funny that Jesus uses the tax collector as an example of how low you can be and how you can rise from it. It's the worst possible example you could think. Just as the crucifixion was the worst possible punishment that Jesus could suffer for us. I mean, you could have said, okay, well, we'll just have him beheaded or something like that over in an instant, or we'll have him shot with arrows, pretty speedy. No, Jesus had to suffer the worst possible agony he could do. And the tax collector, the publican, was used as an example for redemption as the worst type of person there was. And we'll finish this up next week because they're giving me the eyesight. So until then, read your Bible again, note where it mentions publicans, and think what they were. Good night, God bless.